So now I have the honour of introducing the first speaker. John Eldridge is a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, an accolade he's told me he's extremely proud of himself. He's also a chartered engineer, a fellow of the Institute of Mechanical Engineers, and a visiting professor at the School of Engineering at the University of Liverpool, right? Wow. John has over 40 years experience in the nuclear and heavy industry engineering sectors, including design, construction and commissioning and operating of major plants in the UK and overseas. Currently, John is the principal engineer of the U-Battery 10 megawatt advanced modular reactor, which is under development by U-Battery Development Limited. John is now hopefully going to share how he got to where he is today and hopefully provide us with some useful tips and insights along the way. Over to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. And I will do some sharing now, if I may. So just checking, does that come out okay?
Yes, John, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you again, Francis. That's very flattering. You make me sound very important. As I say, I just see myself as a very simple engineer who's happened to have struck lucky. So yeah, this was quite an ask. You know, how did I get here? I've been asked some fairly difficult questions over the past, but this is one. I think it shows up one thing. We're only really always just looking forward. It's quite difficult to actually do a recap and to, if you like, to look at where we came from. And this is what I'm endeavoring to do here. I'll talk a little bit about my background, and it's totally non-engineering. Some early lessons that were actually popping out even as a child, and these things that have stuck with me to this very day. The inspiration that was there. Why on earth did I even think about going into engineering? And I've talked about career decisions, and I'm afraid I'm going to shoot a few holes in this on the way, because I'm going to talk about advice, or rather beware of. I might as well get it out right now. I've actually got to where I have by pretty well ignoring most of the advice that came my way. Not all of it, but a lot of it. Talk a little bit about my training, and including the on-the-job stuff, and getting experience and getting it wrong. Certainly for me as a professional engineer, you've always got to run on that ragged limit of what is possible, which means, of course, invariably you fall over occasionally and you get it plain wrong. Looking about how you take opportunities, the reputation you get, and how, frankly, your career becomes self-perpetuating. I'll talk about my journey, if you like, and what were the key things I learned on the way. So yeah, I was brought up on a small farm. These are tenant farms out in initially in the Chilterns, but they were always hill farms. And of course, there was never any money about the place. In fact, there still isn't. That's not really changed. But one of the things about that, you have to be self-sufficient. Basically, you get exposed to pretty well every job there is, whether it's in the fields, it's maintaining buildings, it's doing repairs on buildings, including joinery and steelwork and thatching occasionally, and ditching and all sorts of things. The education was fairly basic. We had a little village school. I think the roll was probably about 60 or 70, mainly made up of children from farms and foresters and the gardeners and so on. So we were very much out in the rural sticks, if you like. The aspirations were interesting because really from the beginning, it was these high expectations that you were going to follow what your dad did. You know, there was never any real sort of suggestion, any talk about other or alternative options, except possibly working elsewhere on these big estates. So you might have ended up working in the forestry, you might have ended up working in the gardens, but generally semi-skilled or non-skilled skilled work. With leisure, you didn't get a lot of that, because as soon as you were able, you were usually getting oiked out of the house and sent to clear that particular barn or get those sheep in or whatever. I think in the end you ended up as a bit of a two-legged sheepdog, actually. I did, in fact, get quite interested early on in Meccano. I've showed this picture of these beautiful sets in front, and I confess I never saw one like that. They were always well and truly second or third hand by the time they got to me. But I did learn quite quickly, and I was certainly sort of probably about 7 or 8 or so when these started coming into my hands, and I genuinely did love working with them. Of course, we had to be self-sufficient, so I was repairing bikes quite quickly. And the other thing I did, and it was an advantage, of course, being on the farm, I was also getting into some serious running as well. I didn't realize it at the time, but it was an aged aunt who told me many years later that she never saw me walking. Apparently, if they ever saw me around the farm, I was usually running, at a pace. So it was about early lessons coming up, and I'm just seeing it's a story about, I was quite young. I'm not sure if I was at school or not, but I was probably about 5. It was a bitingly cold winter, and yes, I'm afraid it is a bit of rose tinted, but the winters really were very bad all those years ago. And my dad was ploughing in a small field. It was like near the top of the farm, and the old field marshal, the tractor, broke down. Now these field marshals only had a single cylinder. It was a horizontal one, and they used to make a very definite foot as they were working. Anyway, the thing had packed up. The usual response was to curse it, then to kick it, then to hit it, but none of those actually worked. So they brought in the tractor mechanic. And I remember this guy turning up. I mean, I was fascinated by this. And he brought this big wooden box with all his tools in. And there was some old Hessian sacks in there, which he proceeded to place out on the soil alongside the tractor. You know, see, he was going to repair it in the field. There was no question about hoisting it on a low loader and taking it off to the workshop. This was typical of what they do. And he basically started stripping the engine there and then. And the first thing, in fact, he did was drop the sump. And I remember he lowering it off. It was still full of oil, very black, very smelly, very smoky. And then he pulled the single connecting rod and piston out of the barrel. This is horizontally. And now I certainly was talking about, I was getting cold. And in fact, I was freezing. So he wrapped the thing up in a sack and gave it to me to hug like a very hard, very heavy, very awkward hot water bottle. Now, I think about this point, my dad probably took pity and basically sent me back to the farmyard, probably quite reluctantly. But there was no doubt that the repair was probably very simple. It was honing, re-ringing and reassembly. They did the absolute minimum to enable to get the job away and to keep it cheap. But the lessons I learned there, and I still have it in my head, the vision of those rows of tools and spanners neatly laid out, and all the fasteners, all the pieces being very carefully taken off the engine and placed in the box. Of course, I started doing repair work as I got older. And I remember seeing the frustration where you'd see people, you'd carefully lay down your bolts, fasteners, bits onto the earth, and then somebody's great big farm boots kick them into oblivion. I've seen countless times where incidents where time was wasted in workshops and laboratories looking for tools that had been misplaced during a job. And then more recently in my own plants, and then in fact on the race circuits, where of course you were starting to get very concerned, and you had to ensure you knew precisely where all those tools were and everything. So to this day, I insist on that very clear, very defined way of placing the tools or whatever it is you're using on the roll. So it was an early lesson. And then of course, we talk about encouragement, inspiration, if you like, but there was something that was, to this day, I've never fully understood. It seemed to be that, and it's still there in some ways, and it's a UK thing, this, I think. If you are actually quite smart with using your hands, to be able to repair things, to have practical skills, there seems to be an assumption that you're perhaps not that quick upstairs. You know, you're not the quickest thinker. This was certainly explained to us in quite a few ways. I mean, at school, if there was a ball to retrieve off the roof, guess who went up with it? Who was the one who was sent out with the ladders to do it? Can you imagine doing that today now? You know, 7, 8-year-old lads going out with an extending ladder and putting it up at the school wall to get the balls out of the gutters or whatever, putting the decorations up. It was just that feel, and you know, that you weren't quite there. You were, you know, you're okay and you do a good job, but the thinking had to be done by somebody else. And it's funny, I carry that particular baggage almost to this day. But there were others. There was a P&O engineer. He was a retired engineer who'd worked for many, many years on steam and ultimately diesel plant in ships. And he actually had spotted me on the farm. And he felt just playing around, as he said, repairing the farm machinery I could do better. And he had a small shop. He started teaching me about turning, milling, grinding, and so on. And probably most important, he got me to start focusing on my schoolwork. There was no doubt, as I was getting older, like most farm lads, it was getting a bit of a nuisance, this school thing. You know, you were trying to do jobs in the morning before you went to school, you were doing them afterwards. And sometimes you didn't quite get to school because it was a 2.5-mile walk through the woods. There was all sorts of interesting things on the way. There was a teacher in my high school. He taught technical drawings and metalwork. And he encouraged us to do lunchtime projects and to do additional night school. I think he'd spotted something because it was always, again, about the practice. And he organized visits to car plants. We went round Vauxhalls, we went round Fords, we went round some of the big steelworks and foundries in Manchester and elsewhere. And of course, power plants and water treatment plants. So the seed was being sown. And I was actually getting quite a level of encouragement from my father, who had seen the writing on the wall as far as the future of small family farms went. So I decided to go for a craft apprenticeship. I said at 16. In fact, I was still 15 when I was doing the applications. And in fact, I did okay. I applied for 6 apprenticeships and actually got 6, including one to go and work for the Science Research Council and to do the training at Winfrith, which is the picture on the side here, on the right here. But wow, as soon as I announced this is what I was thinking of doing, the advice came piling out to me. And I suspect most of you have had advice coming out of your ears. It's all well meant, of course, people mean to help you. But of course, it's diminishingly small, the number of engineers and so on who are actually directly linked, you know, to families and who are able to give true advice. And you can see some of the samples that were given to me. And as I say, all well-meaning. And some of these were family members. The one from the bottom, you will have a job for life at the Vulcan. Well, actually, that lasted about 10 years before they built a housing estate on it. And then, of course, the ultimate one, you know, I was thinking of going into the nuclear, and there was this, you have to be intelligent to work for the atomic. So you get encouragement like that is pretty devastating. But I made my decision. I wanted to go where Francis was actually talking just now. I wanted to go into what was then a pretty new industry. And it was growing. It was definitely the place to go for carbon neutral. And even then it was being discussed all those years ago about, you know, the impact on the planet. I like the idea of going on a brand new site with bespoke facilities, new trainings, and it did have sports. In fact, one aspect of what we did was every morning we did gym for half an hour, and then we would do gym at lunchtime and sports and all sorts, and that was great. there were sites all over the country which you got sent to during your training. And perhaps most important, it was a couple of 100 miles from home. So, and that's where I started. So one of the things I've mentioned about advice, but I actually did get something, quite a close steer within a year, within a few weeks of starting my first year. It was from one of the fourth-year apprentices, and he said, look, get your head down. He said, that first year is extraordinarily important to you. He said, it's arguably the most important of your apprenticeship. In actual fact, that 16 to 17 year approach was proved to be the most important of my career, because it set the trajectory. It actually set the standard and so on that I was going to work to. We had to make, basically, as craft apprentices, we were making a tool set. And this, what you see, the picture on the right, is my engineer's vice. In fact, I've still got all the tools that I made. And you can see there's grinding, milling, turning, screw cutting, heat treatment, and so on in there. And I was fortunate enough to be awarded the first prize for the first year apprentices. There was something that was significant in there, which thank goodness has changed now. There were 70 boys on that course, and it was just boys. And I remember the question, it literally, that was changing within a couple of years of me starting. Thank goodness that we were starting to encourage everybody to become an apprentice. And then you can see I went through the second, third, and fourth years and did the various parts of the training. But perhaps significantly, on that second year, I was actually seconded out from the training school to go and actually work in a laboratory. They were short-handed. They wanted to have somebody in quickly, and they apparently looked at my track record and said, could we borrow him for 6 weeks? So very, very quickly, I was starting to get moved into, if you like, other opportunities. And the prizes kept coming. And by the time I got to the fourth year, I won the overall prize for the apprentices, and again, another secondment. So the point I'm making here is that the opportunities were starting to pop up from outside, if you like, the normal routine, the normal route. So where have we got to? So it was then starting to learn about other, sorry, it keeps jumping around. I'm not sure what. From other, as I was moving into design offices, I was moved around the country at different sites. So the senior draftsmen basically were talking about planning and helping me with codes and standards and so on. I was starting to become more deeply involved with professional engineers. And one of the things they were saying was about behaviors, about honesty, attitude, the respect. I mean, clear and unambiguous communications. Just think where Gary was going just now in his comments, about the comms. Talking with a customer, making darn sure you knew exactly what the customer wanted before you started committing. And perhaps one of the big ones was, in terms of that commitment, in terms of that communications, was how did you capture those ideas? And the point was made is keep away from the drawing board, keep away from the CAD system, just draw and draw and draw and draw, sketch and sketch, if you like. And that's one of mine on the right. It was for a plant I had to pull out it's about 10 years ago now, but it just gives an indication where I was throwing ideas on. And the thing is, when you draw and you sketch like this, it's something that's disposable. You can screw it up and throw it off. You can knock out these things one every perhaps 1, 2, 3 minutes at a time. And I've used beer mats, table settings. I've even had to buy a tablecloth before now out of a restaurant, because I'd scrawled and drawn all over it. The thing is, once you capture those ideas while paper is cheap, as soon as you start moving in towards the CAD or even then onto steel, the costs start shooting up. And of course, I was making mistakes and being encouraged to, but I was also getting heavily involved in in motorsport, it was something that caught my eye, and we were running a small team as young engineers. And one of the things, we were being supplied with parts by Cosworth Engineering at Northampton. And I asked one day if I could have a tour of the factory, because I was going down to Mills Road down there on a James Mill Road. And it was fantastic because I was told it'd be about a 45-minute tour. In fact, I was actually given a 3-hour tour by Keith Duckworth, who was the founder of the company. And as I say, I don't tend to do hero worship, but that's about as close as it got. And he was an incredible engineer who really quizzed you, and he would not let you go if you just came out with what he'd call a sloppy answer, a slack answer. And there'd been an issue that they'd been having on the Grand Prix engines about premature failures around the camshaft valve gears on the top end of the engine. And he'd asked my opinion, and I put out a bit lamely that perhaps we could tighten up the tolerances between the valve stems and the slides. And his response was pretty devastating. He said, "That's a lazy engineer solution. You're just pushing the problem onto the machinists." In other words, I wasn't thinking the problem through and resolving it. I was just pushing it back onto someone else. So again, a serious lesson. Always think of the person who's going to make whatever it is you do. It's quite devastating when you get that telephone call from the workshop. You're asked to go down to the machine shop or whatever, and there's usually the foreman and half a dozen machinists standing in a ring around the component that you've designed, and then they say, "Right, how do you want us to drill that hole?" And you're shuffling your feet, and you really wish you could fall through the floor. They've usually got the solution, by the way, but it's usually good to ask them before you actually commit to paper. So I worked on the UK's research reactors. The picture there is of Dragon. That was at Wimfrith. It's a high temperature gas reactor. And in fact, the irony of it is I'm actually working on high temperature gas reactors now. And I actually did my very first full design from the concept right through to to actually seeing the piece in my hand as a working machine. You could actually hold it in 2 hands, so it was quite small, but it was very, very proud moment for me, because in the end, it's making things that matters here. It's not about piles of paper. It's not about reports. It's actually making things. The secondments continued. I ended up in the space lab. I was on advanced reactors. I even did a stint as an instructor, and gosh, that was a learning experience. When you've got 20 apprentices under you, and suddenly you're responsible for their training, for their safety, and everything else. As I mentioned earlier, we were running a motorsport team. And with the construction and the funding, etc. Yes, I did the 30-minute paper competition. Francis was talking about the Nuclear Institute, and I'm proud to say I was a winner of that. I was also being mentored by now towards registration. So capability was starting to crank up. I was asked to join a very large, the first design team on a large nuclear plant. And this was really the opening of the big time for me. It was a change of company, but it was new. There were new concepts. There was innovation, and it was just nice that that by now we were starting to get handpicked. And in fact, it was the last time I actually applied for a job. So I was probably about 30 at the time. And I remember the last time I actually applied to, filled in a form. After that, reputation took me forward. I'm just going to start hustling along. I'm acutely aware of timing here. But I started, I was probably getting a bit arrogant, probably a little bit big for my boots, because I'd got this huge job, which most mechanical engineers would have given their hind teeth for. But I started missing something, and one of them was communications. I was wanting to bring in some new materials. I was wanting to bring in some new geometry and so on the business of handling nuclear fuel. And to my chagrin, I hadn't been communicating. I hadn't been bringing my chief engineer or his deputies up to speed. So when I came to deliver this thing for the design review, they said no. I didn't hear the no. And I kept plowing on to the point where that chief engineer wrote those 2 letters on his blackboard at the end of the room. So yet again, I'm sitting there with my face glowing red, wishing again I could fall through the floor, when he said, "John, what is it about this word you do not understand?" So I had a bit of rebuilding to do. And in fact, this is where I used my Meccano. I was pretty convinced that the solution I had was correct. So I actually made a model of the machine in Meccano, and then I clamped it to his desk early one morning, to the chief engineer's desk, and sure enough, he came along, had a look at it, played with it for a while, and then said, "Okay, we'll go with it. But I want to have the geometry, I want you to build a prototype for me," which is what you've got on the right. And in actual fact, I ended up building the machine and getting my charter on that. I mean, I've thought about it since, and it was pretty obvious he was going to give me yes anyway, but they were teaching me a lesson. I'd been making assumptions. I'd been assuming it was obviously the thing to do, so they would say yes, it would be okay. Never do that. If you do, though, occasionally, and you will have to occasionally convert a no to a yes. And if you do that, and I've had to do that in the past, you plan it, because it will take you multiple visits to convert and gradually underpin that stage to the point where you get your no to a yes. And it can be typically 10, 11, 12 steps to get that no to a yes. And it does work. I've done that. So things were starting to accelerate. I was starting to get onto bigger plants. I got involved in construction. I mean, I'm talking about plants with investment around sort of 500 million capital. The particular one that I'd got here was, well, the analogy was you could put St. Paul's Cathedral inside it. So you can see the list of kits I was putting together. And as I say, it was a mechanical engineer's dream. I had large teams of engineers, techs, and craftsmen. In fact, there was over 100 people at one point working on this for me. So now I'm very much involved in safety and regulations. And now increasingly talking about communication again, stakeholders and the media. So it was a regular thing to have to take the TV crews and news crews, local politicians and international politicians around the place. All really, really good experience. Reputation starting to build up by now. And so I was still getting the secondment, but one of them that was coming out now was, "Would you investigate this? We've had a problem." Or can you see if you can pull another solution out for us? We're running out of money. We're running out of time. And I call these parachute jobs, where you're dropped in at short notice to try and sort something out, to come up with and it's an interesting place to be, because the personal satisfaction is so incredible, because you're on your own more often than not, or with your own very small team tucked in with you. But it can get quite personal. People have invested sometimes years and years and years of their career on a project that you've basically going to trash. It can be quite difficult going into those places. You can go into drawing offices and you just hear the sound drop away, and all you can hear is your name, being mentioned. You have to work from first principles, because the various design systems have only produced a dud. But as I say, it's incredibly satisfying when you do it. I continue to get secondments. I mean, this has been a thing right through my career. and of one of them now being very much about I was seconded to Whitehall in London, and this is 20 odd years ago, and it was about low carbon power technology. It was actually the early wind turbines. I was sent overseas. I was sent to France, to Australia, and so on to work on similar large-scale projects. I was getting more and more involved with the Institute Mechanicals. I was actually the chairman of the selection boards for people going for their corporate membership. Been involved in STEM really from the beginning. I was a design judge on the Formula Student competition, again from the beginning when it first came to the country. And then, as Francis says, I was fortunate to be elected to the academy a little while ago. So, as I said, I've been fortunate that not having to apply for work or for jobs. The recent ones was, would you like to be involved on a big national project? This was the big nuclear build, initially at Westinghouse with AP1000s, then more lately Wilver, and now very much on the micro reactor, the U battery. And in fact, this picture on the right is the mock-up that I've just built. It was commissioned 3 weeks ago. So it's the first piece of tangible evidence for the 4th generation nuclear reactors that we're hoping or will be pushing to basically become the fundamental baseload for electricity supply and the supply of high temperature heat to the UK and overseas markets. So how did I get here? Well, you've got formal on the job training, you've got continual professional development, you've got registration. So you've got, there's a line going through your career that you need to populate. But after that, it's about creating opportunities. You know, you have to decide what sort of person you are. You know, do you make things happen? You know, a bit like Nick, about Gary, and about like all the other guys Francis, who made this thing happen called Chain. They saw an issue and made it happen. Or do you watch? Or do you wonder? You know, you've got to sort of have that picture in your head. People have accused me of being lucky. And I thought, well, yeah, for luck, I've had to work pretty bloody hard for it. But there's no doubt luck has had a role in some way, but you can't rely on it. It's a pretty fickle thing. One thing I always learned to do was say yes to the question. Will you go to? Can you fly to? Can you investigate? Will you lead this? Would you consider moving to our company? Pretty well, the answer is yes. The answer is yes, it gets you there. It gets you into these places for opportunities. So, you know, this was really my journey. I have no family background in engineering or tertiary education. In fact, my dad left school at 14. I did an apprenticeship, but that was right for me. That doesn't mean it's right for everybody. In fact, it patently isn't, but it was the right choice for myself. I had a very broad-based professional education from some incredible people. I had strong mentoring. I made mistakes and was allowed to make mistakes. I got early responsibility, but I was also able to develop a reputation for delivery, and that gave more responsibility, more opportunities. Those opportunities were always taken. I would always say yes. I developed a second core skill away from my basic nuclear mechanical engineering, if you like, and that in motorsport engineering. And I was fortunate to be able to go all the way up to becoming a senior scrutineer, including involved on Formula One and other international motorsports. My opinion was sought in companies, institutions, professions, and it was nice to be on stands, to be able to share the knowledge. And of course, this is payback, including today. So what is engineering for me? Well, it's a creative art. We need imagination and thought. To me, it's the equivalent to writing a song or making a film. Probably the biggest and the most important thing of all of it for me is that we work with such incredible people. You know, these are people you have to trust and rely on. There's unfortunately some pictures of people that engineers sit in solitary places, beavering away, talking to no one. It's absolutely not the way it is. You have to be able to work with these people. Your reputation is on the line. Everybody's reputation is on the line. It's the ultimate team game. The respect is earned. There's certainly no place for egos. They don't last very long. And we're looking for creating real 3D objects. And that means people have to be curious. They want to know what's going on. And certainly I can understand Nick's frustration about people not going to the events, you know, to understand what others are doing. And I love those mixed events. I used to love going to the aerospace events and the civils and so on. As a mechanical engineer, it was fantastic to see what was in their toy box. You need strong nerves because at times it gets tough. You have to be able to communicate to everyone. If you can't get the message over to a 6-year-old or a 60-year-old, if you can't get it over to a politician or a fellow, that's your problem. You've failed. If you can't get that message in, that's on you. And that can include people in the media and so on. It's no point in always looking at someone else. It's you. You always want to do it better. So it can be tough, but it's an honorable place to be. And of course, it's relevant. Engineers are going to be about maintaining and repairing, by God, I mean repairing our modern society. So I do appreciate your time. I thank you for listening to me. I wish you all the very best wishes with your careers. And if I could just leave a final word, and this was from the Duke of Edinburgh, and I see Yuli nodding there. Everything that wasn't invented by God was invented by an engineer. This is by the Duke of Edinburgh, who certainly loved his engineers. So thank you very much again for your time this morning. I wish you again all the very best.